It's not necessarily about if I should make a toilet out of Worbla. It's more about, can I make a toilet out of Worbla? In last week's stream, I decided to make a toilet out of Worbla. Proof. It kind of ended up looking like a dog's chewy gone wrong. So what I'm going to do this week, I wasn't quite ready to be done with Worbla, even though last week's stream was done with me. It just totally died in like a flaming pile of server downage. Server downage is a thing. So I'm going to try and remake this. As I said, this was done in the stream. It was about an hour and a half before everything crashed. And so it's a little bit of a rushed job, but during the stream, a Worbla representative was present, which was surprising and exciting, and she answered a lot of questions for us. So I am going to try again, and I'm really going to go for the realism this time. I want to try and go from start to finish to create what would look like a real toilet in 1/12 scale.
Look at you, a little tiny toilet for a little tiny baby to... Ah!
Do the painting and the finishing, but try to sculpt everything from Worbla and really see what I can do. So if you're not familiar with what Worbla is, it comes in these plastic sheets that you heat up and then form to whatever you want. So you can kind of place it over something and like create almost like a cast, or you can use it to sculpt. That's what I'm going to be trying to use it for today. Now you might be thinking, Aira, aren't you the one who doesn't make bathrooms in her projects? And you would be correct. That is me. I do not typically make bathrooms in my projects. So why a toilet? They're curvy, complicated shapes, and I feel like if I can figure out how to mold this stuff and make a decent looking toilet, then I can probably make a lot of other things too. I'll learn a lot of techniques throughout this process, and so my fingers are just crossed that I can actually do this. You have to let me pick you up if you want to say hi. Your public awaits, madame. I am going to need to create a bathroom in the Beetlejuice house on the second floor, the indoor outhouse, so I will need a toilet for that. So if this works out, this will be one step toward working on the Beetlejuice house. So without further ado, here is toilet number 2. No pun intended. Here's a closer look at the toilet I was able to create during the live stream. I got the general shape right, but there's lots of details that were lacking. It's kind of wonky. It was really more just to play around with material. I've learned a lot more since I started the live stream, so I'm excited to put that to the test today. Worbla comes in several different colors or types. There's even like a clear type, but today I'm just going to be working with this basic tan. I'm also grabbing some rounded items from my studio so that I have something I can start molding the plastic around. I'm using some sculpting tools and also my heat gun. I did test out using a hair dryer, but I just don't have a great hair dryer. It just didn't seem to work for me, so a heat gun on low was perfect. I'm also pulling up a reference this time. I was just kind of making a toilet from memory in the stream, but a reference is going to be really helpful. In order to heat things up, I'm using a piece of wax paper on top of a paper plate. This is so I can hold it above my work surface and I don't actually cause any harm with my heat gun to my mat that's underneath, because it can kind of bubble up and deform if it gets too hot. I'm just going to make sure to keep my hands out of the way of the heat gun, so if you do try this, wear gloves or just be very, very careful. So the Worbla can just sit on top of the plate, and the wax paper is there because Worbla has glue inside the mixture. So if you're heating it up on a surface you don't want it to stick to, you need to make sure you have wax paper underneath. You're just going to gently warm it up with the heat gun, and then once it's warm, it becomes very pliable or easy to work with. You can even kind of scrunch it up into a ball and make 3D shapes if you would like to. This I tested out just with a small piece, but maybe I could test it out a little bit more in the future. If you decide you don't want a ball, you can heat it up again and then roll it flat. This basically makes Worbla a zero waste product, which I think is really, really cool because you can use every single scrap of this. If you cut off a piece, just store it, and then maybe you can roll it into a ball or roll it back into a sheet again and save it for later. So I'm ready to get started. I just wanted to do a few little extra experiments. Now, one of the things that's very lacking on this first toilet is the bowl that goes on the inside. I'm going to be using this deodorant cap, and that's what I'm going to be making my form from. I'm going to be warming the Worbla off camera for most of this video so that I can shorten it, but anytime you see that the Worbla is being able to be manipulated, just know that it was warmed up just prior to that moment. One of the great qualities about this material is that you can kind of stretch it and pull it so that it fits very closely to whatever form you're trying to get it onto. This is something that's pretty difficult to do with paper. Paper likes to stay flat, and so the fact that this can be stretched and warped is really, really cool. I ended up coming up with this shape and then realized I needed to cut it off into more of an oval shape. I was using the deodorant cap to try and get the shape that I needed. I'm using some tin snips to cut it down a little bit, and then I decided that I needed it to be a little bit more oval, so I went and grabbed an oval template that I have from my drawing supplies, picked out which one was going to be the right size, and then just drew the oval onto the shape. Now that I had this great starting point for the bowl of the toilet, I knew I wanted to add the detail of the drain or the hole that goes in the bowl. So I tried to figure out what the best way to do this was because I didn't want the entire thing to deform. So I needed to make my area of the heat gun a little bit smaller. I wanted to make like a cone effect so that there was a smaller amount of hot air coming out, so a smaller area of my Worbla would be heated. Now I do think in theory this could have worked. Oh, I forgot to tape it on, so it went flying across the desk. In theory this would have worked, but I think because it was like a bowl shape, the hot air ended up just making the entire oval hot, and so it was deforming on its own and really wasn't doing what I wanted. So I decided to do it a different way. I flipped it over upside down, warmed it up again, and then I used a pencil to poke the hole through the toilet bowl. It still ended up deforming, so I just decided to go with it, and I poked the hole and then immediately grabbed the cap that I used to form the bowl in the first place, and then I put it over it, trying to get that shape back that I had previously. This is one of the issues I faced working with it, is trying to get a small enough area warm so I don't warm up the entire thing. Moving forward, I wanted to create the pipe that goes around the hole. It's not going to go anywhere, obviously, but I'm making a little tube of Worbla, and then while it's still warm, it's pretty easy to cut through with a pair of scissors. And then I used a pencil to go ahead and open each side of the tube and bend it a little bit. I'm not quite sure how far you'll be able to see down it once the toilet is complete, but I wanted to give a little bit of realism by the fact that there is like a pipe there or something. One of the other cool qualities about Worbla is it has glue mixed into the mixture that activates whenever it's warm. So in order to connect these two pieces, I warmed up each side, and then I could just put them next to each other, or have contact with each other, and then the glue takes hold and they are connected. I decided to go ahead and reform that bowl and let everything cool down. And doesn't this look like a little elephant? I thought it was cute. Okay, moving on. Next up is one of the hardest parts of the toilet build. I have to make the ceramic throne, I guess, that will hold up the toilet seat. I'm starting by bending over one of the sides to create that, I guess, hook effect that kind of goes inside the toilet. And while it's warm, I'm going to slowly start to bend it into a rounded shape. I did have a few problems with the part of the Worbla that I had pre-bent starting to wrinkle, and so I had to go back with a pencil and really try to sort that out to try and make it smooth, because when you look in the toilet, I do want it to look like it's porcelain, like it's really smooth. It was really helpful to have the bowl part already completed because that gave me a really good shape to start making the entire piece around. I cut off a little bit of the height because a toilet is usually about the same height as a chair, and I want to make sure that I'm staying in 1/12 scale. I'm using the same wooden piece that I used in the stream. I think it really has that kind of cone shape that you're going for when you're making a toilet. And then I started forming it around this piece. I really tried to only warm up the bottom of the Worbla, and then I started stretching it. This part was pretty hard to try and keep wrinkles out of, but somehow it did work. So I just kept working with it, and I grabbed a glue stick which helped me get more of the cylinder look towards the bottom of the toilet stand. Once I was happy with that shape, I could go ahead and connect the bowl and the base while they were both warm so that the glue stuck them together. In the stream, the Worbla rep that was so kind to give suggestions told me to make the seat from a tube that I then flattened with a roller. So that worked really well. I wanted to try it again. And so here you can see me making that tube and then rolling it flat. While it's warm, I went ahead and started bending it into a U shape, and then I'm using the porcelain throne part that I just created, and I'm trying to figure out how big it needs to be. And then once I have that, how I like it, I can go ahead and warm up both pieces and attach it permanently. I am planning on trying hinges with the toilet lid, but I thought it would be pretty complicated to also do it for the seat as well, so that's why I'm going to glue that in place and not worry about it later. But here, I think I can already see an improvement. I was concentrating pretty hard on trying to get this even. I don't think this is probably the best material for free form sculpting round things or things that you want to be symmetrical. What I think Worbla is a little bit better for is what I'm going to refer to as draping, maybe? So if you imagine fondant on a cake, typically if you're making a cake with fondant, you make the cake interior first, then you drape the fondant over top of it and just kind of form it to the cake. I'm still experimenting. That's not a final overview. But to test out my draping theory, I'm going to be using some foam board to make the toilet tank that's going to go on the back of the toilet. So I'm going to use foam board. I'm going to cut out several squares, shape the foam board first so that I have the general shape that I want, and then I'm going to drape the Worbla over top of it, and hopefully I'll get something that's a little bit more symmetrical and a little bit easier to create. For the toilet tank, I'm kind of eyeballing the shape from my reference photo, and I'm just kind of estimating what the size should be compared to the base that I've already created. I'm going to be doing a double layer of foam. I think I could have even done 3 layers, but I really don't want the tank to be too thick because eventually, hopefully, I will be putting it into a dollhouse and I don't want it to stick out too far from the wall. So it's going to be a pretty thin tank. In order to make it a little bit more fancy, I guess, I am carefully beveling the edges with a blade so I have a little bit more of an interesting shape. This is the base that I'm going with that hopefully I can just drape the Worbla over. I'm taking the warm Worbla sheet and I'm just going to push it over all of the edges, making sure it's flat. I haven't had any issues with bubbles underneath, but I imagine they're pretty easily remedied. I'm just going to push it down on each edge, and then at the corners, I'm going to push the corners together so that later on they will be really easy to cut off. If I remember correctly, by the time I was ready to cut off the corners, the Worbla had cooled off enough to make it difficult to cut with scissors. It was easy enough to just put it back on the plate, re-warm the corners, and then cut it off with scissors. Also, during this state, I can kind of manipulate the corners to try and make it look like they match up. Now the back isn't so covered, but in the end you won't end up seeing the back, so I wasn't too worried about it. I also wanted to give an indication of a toilet tank lid, even though I'm not going to be making it removable. To do this, I just made a very small rectangle of Worbla, and I'm going to be applying it in the very same way, where I push down all the edges and then I make little corners that later I can snip off and just try to smooth over at the edge. It wasn't completely even, but it was even enough to make me happy, and I do think this looks like a typical toilet tank. Then it was time to figure out how to connect these two pieces together. I wanted something with a little bit more strength, so I'm going to be doubling over a piece of Worbla and then sticking it together, so hopefully this will have a double thickness and hold up the toilet tank pretty well. I'm just going to roll it flat and allow it to cool before I start adding on the pieces that I need to cut out. I'm cutting out a triangle so it will fit up underneath the back of the toilet I've already created, and I'm making sure it's big enough so that the toilet tank will fit on top. Once I sketch out everything I need to cut off, I warmed up the Worbla just a little bit to make it easier to cut through, especially since now it was a little bit thicker. Once I'm happy with the shapes, I can warm up both pieces and start to stick them together. I'm not going to stick the toilet tank on just yet because I still feel like I have quite a bit to build behind the toilet bowl. Because the forming around the foam board works so well, I'm going to use this piece of wood to help me form the back of the toilet. I'm using some tacky glue, which I wanted to test with Worbla anyway, to see if it would stick. And it did stick pretty well until I started adding heat, and that may just be the fault of the tacky glue. Just when it gets warm, it does get a little bit loose. But it worked when it wasn't warm. I'm going to be adding just a full sheet along the back, and I started to just form it in place, and then I'm using a pencil to figure out where I needed to cut it and what shapes I really wanted. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing here, so I didn't show too much of it. But in the end, basically, I just put a sheet that covered up the area from the wood piece all the way to the bowl I had previously created. Now I want to work on making some pipes that I think are formed into the ceramic toilet. You can see them on the side of my reference. They look like a little bit of an S shape that come from the toilet bowl all the way down to the ground, which would be the pipes that go into the plumbing. So I'm going to be using a long snake that I flattened just like I did for the toilet bowl, and I'm just going to be putting it straight onto the side so I can get the impression of the pipe in the right place. Because this is supposed to look like a pipe that's formed within the porcelain, I heated up all of the area again, and I'm just trying to flatten the edges of the Worbla so that it's as smooth as I can get it before I start the painting process. I realized I was kind of squishing it with my hands because the warming of the pipes had warmed up the front of the toilet, so I added in a pen so that it kind of kept its shape. But here's how both of the sides of the toilet are looking, and now that I'm happy with that, I feel like I can go ahead and put a base on the toilet. I didn't want to do this until afterwards because I didn't want to lose my access to kind of pushing the Worbla back out if I had accidentally dented it. But I don't think I'll be adding much more heat to this bottom part of the toilet build, so I feel like I can just go ahead and add the base and everything will be fine. I also felt like this was a good time to add the toilet tank onto the back, so of course I heated up those two pieces and they glued together perfectly. And here is my base build for the toilet. I am pretty happy with how it's looking. Oh, I also added these two triangles on either side, so in the future I have a place to put the hinges. It's the end of the first day of me really trying hard to create a toilet with Worbla and trying to make it look realistic. I'm pretty happy with the results so far. I think I've probably put about, I would say, 6 hours worth of time of just concentrated trying to figure this out, as opposed to the hour and 45 minutes that I put into the first one. I could stop here and just say, hey, proof of concept. However, like I said in the beginning, I really want to work on the finishing properties, or how well I can finish a piece, to see the different textures I can get, because obviously it still has the texture of not a toilet. So I'm going to pick this back up tomorrow. I'm going to try and keep track of the time as best as I can so you know about how long this took me. I will say I really liked using the method where I made the foam board form for the interior and wrapping the Worbla around it. That worked so much better than trying to form it by hand, and of course it came out a lot more symmetrical. Day 2, I've decided to establish a Worbla scrap bag because my desk is just a mess and I don't want to lose any of my pieces because this can all be reused in the future, especially for miniaturists. So for today, I want to test the boundaries of the finishing that can be done with Worbla. So I want to try and make this look like a smooth porcelain white toilet. As you have seen, it can get a little bumpy in places where I'm really asking it to bend sharply. I also have some connections between two pieces of Worbla that I'm going to try and smooth over. The way I want to do this is with a pretty classic technique. A lot of model makers that use plastic in their builds use this, and it's using liquid super glue along with some baking soda or bicarbonate powder, I think they call it in the UK, but here we call it baking soda. So here we go. This process seems to work best with liquid super glue, and the reason for that is you can put it into a crack or an area you need to fill, and it kind of levels itself out. There is a definite seam between the front and the back of the toilet bowl here, so that's where I'm going to start my testing. I just added some liquid super glue, let it kind of even out, and then I'm dumping some baking soda on top of it. What happens is that the glue and the baking soda harden immediately, and they also harden in 3D, so it kind of fills in that gap. So what I plan to do is to go around anywhere or any edges that need to be smoothed out. I'm going to add the liquid super glue, I'm going to let it kind of even out, and then I'm going to add my baking soda on top so that it is a little bit more smooth than it was before. Here you can see the difference between the side I've done and the side I haven't done. I also know that this stuff is sandable, so I'm going to take my Dremel, and any places where I don't feel like I got it just right or it didn't even out well enough, I'm going to go over that area so it is still as smooth as I can get it. Also, make sure to wear a mask when you're doing this part, if you decide to try it. I also wanted to test out just sanding plain Worbla, so I'm going around the toilet seat, which is probably the most stretched out part. I found that it got a little bit stringy, and that could be because the Worbla was warming up with the friction from the Dremel, so I decided to sand it by hand, and that worked a little bit better. I also wasn't going to worry about the back of this toilet seat. It wasn't going to be seen, so I didn't really care about it. But I know some of you out there, it was going to bother, so I went ahead and covered it with a layer of Worbla. It's not the smoothest thing, but like I said, it's not going to be seen, so moving forward. I'm now going to continue my quest to make this toilet as smooth as I can before the painting process starts. Wood glue is an amazing material for this because it has kind of this self-leveling quality. You can brush it onto a surface, and oftentimes it will have kind of a metallic or porcelain finish once it dries. It does help to have a smooth finish underneath as well because it will kind of get into cracks. I'm just going to be doing one part of the toilet at a time because it does kind of slump if you have to lay it flat, I guess is what I'm trying to say, or else it will all kind of gather at one side. Once it started drying, I could tell there were a ton of bubbles, and I don't know if you can see it on video, but just a ton of bubbles. At first I thought it was the Worbla, but in the Worbla areas there weren't any bubbles, and I think it was the baking soda. Just a quick update from Studio, which is probably the only place you can see me in this house because the power has gone out. So that means I can't use the heat gun, I can't use my lights. So even if I was filming, even though I'm doing things by hand, you couldn't see me. So the camera has some battery, but you would not be able to see anything that I'm doing very clearly. So hopefully that comes back on soon. But for now, I guess I'm just going to hang out with Stormy. We're going to enjoy the quiet. What are you eating? We're just going to hang out and we're going to wait, and the toilet can just chill for a while. I was working on the wood glue part, which can actually, it can dry hopefully while things are getting fixed, maybe. But this is funny that this happened this week because the toilet is normally something that I would 3D print. Where's the printer? But the power going out would have totally ruined a 3D print. It would have been, I would have had to restart it. So yeah, sometimes it's nice to do things by hand. And if I wasn't trying to film it at the same time, I could actually probably just move myself in here and keep going. But I want to make sure that you can see how I finished this project. So we'll just wait until the lights come back on. Shall we? Luckily, the power came back on after not too long, but it was enough time for me to finish the coating with wood glue. I did find that a lot of the baking soda, which I had previously identified as a problem, had come back through the surface of my wood glue. This is not the first time baking soda has really messed with one of my projects, and you can even better now see some of the bubbles that are underneath the surface of the wood glue. So all that prep underneath, I still may not get a smooth surface just because of all these bubbles. I do see that I need another layer of wood glue on the toilet seat just to continue to fill in any of those bumps and grooves. But before that, I'm going to go ahead and sand it again. I do feel like sanding the wood glue is a little bit easier than sanding the Worbla. I also went ahead and cut out a toilet seat that's going to sit on top of the toilet. This one I do want to try and make move. Once I put this on, you could kind of see I had a little bit of a uneven toilet seat, which is fine. This is all an experiment. I'm just trying to get it as best as possible. During the live stream, I did try to create hinges out of Worbla itself, but I had a lot of issues with the Worbla warming up and getting stuck to the other hinges. So instead, I'm going to make hinges out of 3 cylinder beads and a sewing pin. The cylinder beads fit right onto the sewing pin, and it ended up being the perfect length for the back of the toilet seat lid. So what I'm going to do is add 2 daubs of super glue, and then I'm just going to carefully push the toilet seat onto the 3 beads, hoping that I really only get super glue on the 2 beads. The center bead is going to be glued to the toilet itself so that I have a proper hinge. Once they were glued on, I added some wood glue to the toilet seat as well, and I made sure that wood glue went over the beads so I had an extra amount of strength holding the hinges on. I added my second layer of wood glue to the toilet seat, and then I'm going to let those dry. Once it's dry, I could go ahead and attach the center bead to the toilet. I added it back onto the lid and then added the pin in so I could make sure I got it in the right spot. I'm testing, and I'm going to mark where that center bead is sitting. This is just going to be a little indentation in the wood glue so I know where to put the super glue. It's incredibly important that I only put glue where that center bead is going to be, because if the glue gets on the other beads, my hinge will glue in place and it won't work. So I'm allowing that to take hold, and as soon as I do, I can take out the sewing pin, remove the toilet lid, and then make sure that that center bead is right there. And I'm just going to let it dry by itself so I don't have any chance of that glue getting anywhere else on my hinge. Once it was glued in place, I went ahead and did the baking soda trick again. I know I had issues with it, but I just decided, you know what, it was holding everything in place pretty well, so I want to make sure this hinge does not come off. I'm continually adding the pin back into the beads to make sure I don't accidentally fill the holes, because that too would ruin my hinge. Once I have done all the super glue and baking soda to the hinge pieces, I'm going to add it back on and make sure that everything functions. And it does. It opens up pretty smoothly, honestly. I am very happy with how the hinge is working. Among all this mess is now a lonely toilet ready to be painted. I'm going to start with a layer of gesso, mostly because I have several different materials showing here. I have baking soda that's throwing a fit, And I want to make sure that my top coat of paint has as good of a chance as possible. So I'm laying down a layer of gesso and then I'm going to do regular white acrylic paint on top. It's this layer that let me see anything that was still kind of rough or bumpy, and so I took my sandpaper and sanded down any areas that I just didn't like. Then I just touched up any of the sanded areas and prepared my toilet and toilet lid for paint. I hung the toilet lid up so it would be easy to get the glaze on. I'm going to be using triple thick glaze. This stuff is just like it says, it's triple thick, so just one spray will give you a really nice gloss finish. It may be a little bit hard to tell on camera, but it does really have a porcelain looking effect once it's applied. I do think I could do with another layer of sanding and another layer of triple thick glaze, but the stuff takes a long time to dry and I just don't have time to do that this week. So I'm not going to be permanently attaching the toilet lid yet in case I want to do that in the future. But I am just going to show you how it attaches temporarily. I had the pin in the toilet lid so the triple thick glaze wouldn't fill in the hinges, and then I just carefully took that out. I'm going to get a brand new sewing pin so it doesn't have anything that will make the hinge not function, push it back through the beads, and then make sure that it works. All in all, I am super happy with how this came out. It does have its flaws. It does have things that could have been done a little bit better. There were lots of things that I learned as far as like wood glue and baking soda are not friends. If you do want to permanently attach your hinge, if you're trying this at home, cut off the pointy end of your sewing pin. Make sure to cut it off into a tissue so you don't lose that piece somewhere. Add some super glue to the other end and then just push it into the bead so that it's only glued to that one bead on the end and it shouldn't come out and you will have a permanently attached hinge. If you want to try Worbla, I will have a link in the description, but let me know what you thought about this. Let me know what you think Worbla would be really useful for in your own projects. I think it could be really cool for some Tim Burton-y type stuff coming up in the Beetlejuice house. Oh, my sign. I ended up finishing and spraying this project last night, kind of right before I went to bed because I wanted the triple thick glaze to have enough time to dry overnight. So I will say that this project probably took all of yesterday, including the day before that. However, most of that was dry time. So the amount of time I actually spent working on this, like with my hands on the toilet, was probably about 2 hours. So I'm going to take the dry time out of that because I was doing other things while it was drying. I was editing a little bit. I was working on some stuff for my store. So I'm going to say about 2 hours plus the 4 hours from the day before. So about 6 hours of active working time to create this toilet. Obviously, this one was done after I'd had a little bit more experience because this was my first test. But just putting a little bit more time and focus and trying out other materials and experimenting can really bring a pretty awesome result, in my opinion. Is it the most perfect toilet in the world? Probably not. Are there other ways to create a toilet that may be a little bit better, a little bit smoother? Probably so, but this whole video was about working with Worbla, really pushing its limits and trying to see what I could do. So now I have a lot better idea of what this material is, how I can transform it. I'll probably still 3D print any toilets I need in the future. But now I have a much better idea of what Worbla can be used for and what it would be really useful for in miniatures, and I look forward to working with it more. One thing I did want to mention that I've had a few other people say is the worry about Worbla kind of getting like warm in storage or something like that and maybe drooping. I really don't know how that will work. Slightly tempted to go put this in my attic in Texas, and if it can survive an attic in Texas, it can survive anything. But I also really like it and don't want to ruin it, so I'm not sure. Oh, I totally forgot to put a flusher thing. But I do think that the extra, like the glue and everything that's been added to it, could possibly, and the structure, there's like a wood beam in here, could possibly keep it from slumping. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Boop. Now I can talk to you. Blabbity 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 blabbity. Picking up the pieces of my mess. Blah 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 blah. Mess contained for now.